Sofia Mendez's fingers worked methodically through the sourdough, a motion so ingrained in her muscle memory that she could have done it blindfolded. The kitchen of Crumb and Crust was quiet at 4:30 a.m., just how she preferred it, the calm before the storm of the day's baking. The scent of fermentation hung in the air, yeasty and complex, a perfume more precious to her than any designer fragrance. As she folded the dough with practiced hands, Sofia found her mind wandering to the staff meeting scheduled for later that morning. She had known this day was coming for months, had prepared meticulously for it, but that didn't ease the heaviness in her chest. At 9:15 a.m., James would announce that Ethan Bennett would take over as executive baker, and Sofia, founder, master baker, the heart and hands of Crumb and Crust for 18 years, would be transitioning to a consulting role. Sofia shaped the last loaf and placed it in a proofing basket, then covered it with a damp cloth. She straightened, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back, and caught her reflection in the stainless steel of the refrigerator door. At 52, her once jet-black hair now carried streaks of silver that she'd stopped bothering to color. Laugh lines framed her eyes, evidence of a life spent in genuine joy before the past 6 months had taught her to school her expressions. She washed her hands, dried them on her apron, and moved to check her reflection in the small mirror behind the kitchen door. Today would test every ounce of her composure, a test she'd been preparing for since the whispers began 6 months ago. 18 years earlier, Sofia had opened Crumb and Crust with nothing but 3 family recipes, a second-hand mixer, and an oven that required constant coaxing. Her formal culinary education consisted of weekend baking classes and countless hours in her grandmother's kitchen in Mexico City. What she lacked in credentials, she made up for in passion and perfectionism. The tiny shop barely broke even for the first 2 years. Sofia worked 16-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the storage room to save on rent, waking at 3 a.m. to begin the day's bread. She experimented endlessly with flour ratios, hydration levels, and fermentation times, determined to create breads with character. Chewy, flavorful loaves that bore no resemblance to the mass-produced bread most customers were accustomed to. Sofia's breakthrough came in the 3rd year when a food writer happened to taste her sourdough and wrote a glowing review in the City magazine. In an age of shortcuts, the writer proclaimed, Sofia Mendez took the long road, and the difference was evident in every bite. Business tripled within a month. Sofia hired her first assistant, then another. She expanded the menu to include pastries, drawing from her grandmother's recipes but adding her own refinements. When the neighboring storefront became available, Sofia approached 3 regular customers who had mentioned investment interests, and Crumb and Crust expanded. James Harrington was one of those initial investors. A retired finance executive with a passion for good food, he had been enchanted by Sofia's commitment to quality and her infectious enthusiasm when she spoke about fermentation processes or the nuances of different grain varieties. He assured her she had created something special, not just good bread, but the preservation of an art form. For years, their partnership worked beautifully. James handled the business aspects that Sofia found tedious, freeing her to focus on baking and recipe development. When Sofia wanted to begin milling her own flour, James crunched the numbers and found a way to make it work. When she insisted on sourcing only from local organic farms despite the higher cost, James adjusted their pricing strategy. They were united in the belief that quality should never be compromised. Crumb and Crust gained a reputation as the premier artisanal bakery in the city. Sofia trained dozens of bakers over the years, many of whom went on to open their own successful bakeries. She was invited to speak at culinary schools and industry conferences. A cookbook publisher approached her about sharing her techniques and recipes. Life was good. Sofia's days were exhausting, but fulfilling. The constant ache in her shoulders from kneading was a badge of honor. Each customer's appreciation was validation of her life's work. And then, Ethan Bennett arrived. Sofia first met Ethan at a food industry mixer that James had convinced her to attend. Networking was important, he'd insisted, though Sofia would have much preferred spending the evening testing a new rye recipe. Ethan was 34, with a degree from a prestigious culinary institute and 3 years of experience at a famous bakery in Paris. He had worked briefly in New York before moving west, and had gathered an impressive Instagram following with his photogenic creations. He was charming, enthusiastic, and as Sofia would later discover, the nephew of one of James's golf buddies who had become a minor investor in Crumb and Crust during their second expansion. James introduced them enthusiastically, mentioning that Ethan had been following Sofia's work for years and even credited her cookbook with inspiring his focus on artisanal baking. Sofia had been flattered, of course. Ethan spoke passionately about bread, asking detailed questions about her fermentation techniques and attending one of her weekend workshops. When James suggested bringing him on as a consultant to help develop new product lines, Sofia agreed. Fresh ideas could complement her traditional approaches, she thought. Crumb and Crust had always been about quality, but perhaps there were innovations she hadn't considered. For the first few months, the arrangement seemed beneficial. Ethan introduced a line of visually striking laminated pastries that attracted a younger clientele. His social media posts showcasing their products increased foot traffic. He organized a series of evening baking classes that sold out immediately. Sofia began to notice the subtle shifts in her fourth month working with Ethan. Her weekly menu planning meetings were rescheduled when Ethan had creative sessions with the staff. Her signature breads were quietly modified with Ethan's improvements, higher hydration for an open crumb structure that photographed beautifully but, to Sofia's taste, compromised the eating experience. The Sofia's original label on her grandmother's conchis recipe disappeared, replaced with House Classic. She tried to dismiss her concerns as resistance to change. She reminded herself that businesses needed to evolve. But when she overheard James on the phone discussing Ethan's vision for modernizing our approach, a cold unease settled in her stomach. Sofia began paying closer attention. The way conversations in the kitchen paused when she walked in. How Ethan's assistant began ordering supplies without consulting her. The quiet reshuffling of morning shift responsibilities. Small changes in recipes presented as minor adjustments, but that fundamentally altered the character of her breads. One morning, she arrived to find Ethan demonstrating a new shaping technique to her staff, a faster method that sacrificed the proper tension in the dough for the sake of efficiency. When she questioned him, he explained patronizingly that customers couldn't tell the difference, but they could increase production by 20%. Sofia countered that customers might not immediately notice, but they would feel the difference in their experience, even if they couldn't articulate it. Quality, she reminded him, takes time. Ethan had given her that indulgent smile one might give a well-meaning but outdated relative. His response about time being money and staying competitive rang hollow to her ears. That evening, Sofia stayed late reviewing the bakery's financial records, which she had largely left to James for years. The numbers were healthy, showing steady growth. There was no financial crisis necessitating increased production or cost-cutting measures. What she did notice was that the investment portfolio had shifted. Several new names had been added, including Ethan's uncle, whose stake had quietly grown. The official conversation happened early on a Monday, after Sofia had spent a weekend connecting the dots. James caught her as she was finishing her morning baking shift, asking her to join him in the office. He began by discussing the future direction of Crumb and Crust with unusual formality, unable to meet her eyes as he spoke. James explained that they were repositioning for a more contemporary market. Ethan, he said, brought a social media presence and aesthetic that appealed to younger customers. The board, or rather, the investor group, felt his approach aligned better with where the market was headed. Sofia questioned the existence of a board. As far as she knew, there was no formal board, just James and the original investors. James shifted uncomfortably, explaining that with the additional capital they'd brought in, there was a consensus about needing a more current approach. When Sofia asked if her approach was considered outdated, James hurried to assure her that her expertise remained invaluable. That's why, he explained, they wanted her to step back into a consulting role. Her recipes, he emphasized, were still the foundation of what they did. The translation was clear to Sofia. At 52, her methods were deemed too time-consuming, and her resistance to food trends had become inconvenient. Though her heart pounded, Sofia nodded calmly and inquired about the timeline. James revealed their plan to announce it at the following week's staff meeting, with Ethan officially taking over as executive baker with full creative control. Sofia would retain her ownership stake, of course, and they would formalize a consulting agreement. Sofia thanked James for considering a transitional role rather than a complete separation. Inside, she felt as though her oven had collapsed, but outwardly, she was flower-dusted dignity personified. She expressed appreciation for his directness and mentioned she would need to consider what this meant for her role. As she left his office, Sofia realized two things with perfect clarity. She had been slowly, deliberately pushed aside in the business she had built from nothing, and she had seen it coming months ago but had refused to acknowledge it. That evening, after the last customer left, Sofia sat alone in the bakery kitchen, her sanctuary for nearly 2 decades. The space still smelled of the day's bread, a comforting perfume of yeast and caramelized crust. She ran her hand over the scarred wooden workbench where she had shaped thousands of loaves, taught dozens of apprentices, and poured her heart into her craft. With determined calm, she picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Gabriela Torres, who had been one of her first apprentices 15 years ago. Gabriela now operated a community kitchen across town, teaching cooking skills to underserved neighborhoods and supplying bread to local food banks. After warm greetings, Sofia inquired about the empty commercial space next to Gabriela's kitchen, the one Gabriela had mentioned wanting to develop into a teaching bakery. Gabriela confirmed it was still available but expressed concern about Sofia's unusually direct question. Sofia admitted things weren't okay but would be, promising to explain everything the next day. Her second call was to Elena Vasquez, the lawyer who had helped her structure her original partnership agreement with James years ago. Sofia requested clarity about her rights regarding recipes and techniques under their current partnership structure, as well as any restrictions on her future activities should she leave Crumb and Crust. Elena, sensing the seriousness of the situation, offered a meeting the following morning and assured Sofia of her discretion. After ending the call, Sofia pulled out her notebook, the original, oil-stained journal where she had documented every recipe development, every experiment, every technique she had perfected over the years. She ran her fingers over the pages, feeling the raised textures where water had warped the paper, where flour had embedded itself into the binding. This, at least, was hers. The soul of what she had built was in these pages and in her hands, not in the increasingly corporate structure of the business that bore her stamp but was no longer truly hers. Sofia took a deep breath and began to plan. For the next week, Sofia continued her regular routine, arriving before dawn, mixing doughs, and supervising the morning bake. She smiled through planning meetings where Ethan suggested cutting fermentation times to increase production, nodded politely when he introduced pre-packaged fillings to replace her house-made ones. Ethan explained to the staff that fresh raspberry preserves required consistent attention to inventory and quality control, while their new supplier offered a premium product with consistent results and extended shelf life. Sofia remained silent, though she knew the premium product contained stabilizers and additional pectin that compromised the pure fruit flavor she had always insisted upon. Her silence was noted. A few staff members glanced at her with surprise, but she maintained her composure. In the evenings, after her shifts, Sofia met with Gabriela and Elena to formalize their plan. The empty space beside Gabriela's community kitchen was perfect, a former restaurant with much of the necessary equipment still in place. It would need renovation, but the bones were good. Together, they envisioned a baking school with a small retail component, hearth and hand. Sofia described their concept: weekday classes for aspiring professionals, weekend workshops for home bakers, with the retail space selling what they produced in classes, plus a curated selection of daily breads. Gabriela enthusiastically added that they could continue her community outreach program, teaching basic skills to people who needed economic opportunities. Elena reviewed Sofia's partnership agreement carefully, confirming that her non-compete clause applied only to commercial bakeries within a 5-mile radius of Crumb and Crust. A baking school with incidental retail fell outside that restriction. Additionally, Sofia retained rights to any recipes she developed prior to the formation of the partnership and any personal variations she created during her tenure. Regarding her ownership stake, Elena explained that Sofia was entitled to continued profit distributions according to her 25% ownership. If they wanted to buy her out, the agreement specified a valuation method based on average profits over the past 3 years. They couldn't force her to sell, but given the circumstances, it might be cleaner to negotiate an exit. Sofia decided not to initiate that conversation, preferring to let them approach her if that's what they wanted. For the next month, Sofia lived a double life. By day, she was the increasingly marginalized founder of Crumb and Crust, watching as her life's work was gradually transformed. By night, she was the architect of her next chapter, planning curriculum, designing kitchen layouts, and securing financing for hearth and hand. She was careful to leave no traces of her plans at Crumb and Crust. She organized her recipe notebooks at home, took only 1 or 2 personal items from her office each day so no one would notice, and meticulously documented the provenance of every recipe she had developed. Most importantly, she spoke individually with each staff member she had personally trained, asking about their ambitions and concerns about the bakery's new direction. She listened carefully, offering no criticism of the changes underway, but noting which employees seemed uncomfortable with the new approach. Each conversation ended the same way, with a small card bearing her personal number and a gentle suggestion to keep in touch, whatever happened. 3 staff members approached her privately afterward, expressing their unease with the direction Ethan was taking. Sofia neither encouraged nor discouraged their loyalty to her, simply listening and acknowledging their concerns. She was playing a long game now. As the date of the staff meeting approached, the meeting where her demotion would be officially announced, Sofia felt a strange sense of calm. The initial shock and hurt had crystallized into determination. She had survived harder challenges than this. She had built something from nothing once. She could do it again. The morning of the staff meeting dawned clear and cool. Sofia arrived at Crumb and Crust at her usual time of 4 a.m., tied on her apron, and began mixing the day's doughs as she had thousands of times before. The familiarity of the motions was comforting, measuring flour by feel, testing water temperature with a finger, judging dough hydration by the sound it made as it slapped against the sides of the mixer. By 8:30 a.m., the day's breads were shaped and proofing. The pastry team was glazing the morning's croissants. The front-of-house staff was setting up the display cases. It was a normal day except for the thread of tension running beneath the surface. Several staff members knew what was coming and had been avoiding Sofia's eyes all morning. At 8:45 a.m., Sofia slipped into the small office she had once shared with James, but that had gradually been taken over by Ethan's materials. She placed an envelope on James's desk, her formal resignation, effective immediately, along with a USB drive containing detailed histories of each signature recipe and their evolution over the years. It wasn't legally necessary, but Sofia wanted to leave a record of her contribution that couldn't be erased or minimized. She changed out of her flour-covered clothes into the clean outfit she had brought, dark jeans, a crisp white blouse, and a tailored blazer that she rarely had occasion to wear. She brushed her hair, applied a touch of lipstick, and studied her reflection in the small mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed calmer and more confident than she felt. At precisely 9 a.m., the staff gathered in the main kitchen area. 22 people formed a rough semicircle: bakers, pastry chefs, front-of-house staff, and delivery drivers. Sofia positioned herself near the edge of the group, observing the dynamics. Ethan stood close to James, both men in button-down shirts that contrasted with the staff's practical work attire. James began with awkward formality, thanking everyone for being there and noting that Crumb and Crust had been growing steadily. With growth, he explained, comes evolution. He expressed excitement about announcing changes to their leadership structure that would position them for continued success in an increasingly competitive market. Sofia watched faces in the crowd. Most looked down or at each other, avoiding her gaze. Only Marco, her head baker for the past 7 years, met her eyes with an expression of muted anger. James continued, announcing that effective immediately, Ethan Bennett would be assuming the role of executive baker, with full creative control over their product lines and production methods. Ethan, James explained, brought contemporary techniques and market awareness that would help them appeal to a broader customer base and streamline their operations. Ethan stepped forward with a practiced smile, expressing honor at taking on this role and building upon the foundation Sofia had created. He proclaimed tremendous respect for what Crumb and Crust had meant to the community and excitement about leading them into a new era. James nodded, then hesitated slightly before continuing. He announced that Sofia had agreed to transition to a consulting role, where her expertise would remain available to them as needed while giving her more personal time after 18 years of daily hands-on leadership. When 9:15 a.m. arrived and James finished his announcement, Sofia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The charade was over. She smiled genuinely for the first time in months and stepped forward, asking to say a few words. James looked momentarily startled but nodded. Sofia surveyed the room, making eye contact with each person. She spoke of her 18 years at Crumb and Crust, describing it as her heart and her home. She expressed gratitude for the privilege of working with incredible people, many of them in that room, to create something she was deeply proud of. Every loaf, every pastry, every customer interaction had mattered to her. She paused, noting how the tension in the room had shifted. People were watching her with curiosity now, perhaps expecting an emotional outburst. Sofia continued calmly, wishing Ethan and the team every success moving forward. However, she clarified that she wouldn't be transitioning to a consulting role. Instead, she would be opening Hearth and Hand with Gabriela Torres the following month. They would focus on teaching traditional baking techniques and providing baking education to both aspiring professionals and community members. Her resignation letter was on James's desk. The room fell silent. James paled visibly, while Ethan's confident smile faltered. James began to mention her non-compete clause, but Sofia calmly explained that it applied only to commercial bakeries within 5 miles. Hearth and Hand would be a baking school with a small retail component, 8 miles from Crumb and Crust. Her lawyer had confirmed the distinction months ago. She turned to Ethan, whose expression had shifted from confidence to uncertainty. She informed him that her documentation included all the original recipes and methods, along with notations about their development. He was welcome to his variations, of course. Sofia then addressed the staff directly, expressing that it had been an honor to work with each of them. The skills they developed and the care they brought to their work daily were what made Crumb and Crust special. That didn't have to change, regardless of who was leading the kitchen. She untied her apron, the last one she would wear at Crumb and Crust, and folded it neatly on the workbench. As she gathered her bag, Sofia mentioned that Hearth and Hand would be providing all bread and pastries for the City Hall renovation celebration the following month. The mayor's office had been particularly interested in their community baking workshops. The City Hall contract was a prestigious opportunity that Crumb and Crust had been pursuing for weeks, expected to generate tremendous publicity for whoever secured it. Sofia didn't need to explain that her 15 years of providing birthday cakes for the mayor's children had factored into the decision. Everyone in the room already understood the power of personal connections built over years of consistent service. Sofia concluded by stating she'd be available by email to answer any transition questions through the end of the week, and thanked everyone from the bottom of her heart. With that, she walked out of Crumb and Crust for the last time as its leader, her steps lighter than they had been in months. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Sofia and Gabriela worked tirelessly to prepare Hearth and Hand for its opening. They renovated the space, installing additional ovens and workbenches. They developed curriculum for various skill levels and created a schedule of classes. They designed marketing materials emphasizing their commitment to traditional techniques and community engagement. Word spread quickly throughout the local food community about Sofia's new venture. Former customers and industry colleagues reached out to express support. 3 days after her departure from Crumb and Crust, Marco, her head baker, called to ask if she had any positions available. He explained that he couldn't work under the new conditions. The day before, Ethan had announced they were switching to commercial yeast for all daily breads except the premium artisan line, claiming customers couldn't taste the difference and it would cut production time. Sofia was unsurprised but saddened. She immediately offered Marco a position. Within 2 weeks, 4 more staff members from Crumb and Crust had joined Hearth and Hand, 2 bakers, a pastry chef, and the front-of-house manager who had been with Sofia from the beginning. Sofia welcomed them without gloating or encouraging criticism of their former workplace. This wasn't about revenge. It was about building something authentic. The mayor's office confirmed their contract for the City Hall celebration, requesting an assortment of breads and pastries reflecting the city's diverse culinary traditions. Sofia and her team designed a menu showcasing techniques from multiple cultures: Mexican conchas, French baguettes, Italian focaccia, Jewish challah, and more, each with a story connecting it to the community. Sofia's lawyer negotiated terms with James regarding her continued ownership stake in Crumb and Crust. After initial resistance, James proposed a buyout. The figure was fair, based on the valuation method specified in their agreement, and Sofia accepted. She invested the proceeds directly into Hearth and Hand, upgrading equipment and expanding their capacity for community programs. As opening day approached, Sofia found herself working 18-hour days again, just as she had when starting Crumb and Crust. But this time was different. She was 52 now, with decades of experience behind her and a clear vision ahead. She felt a sense of purpose and freedom that had been missing in recent years. She also noticed that she was sleeping better than she had in months, despite the physical demands of launching a new business. The weight of pretending everything was fine, of watching her life's work being dismantled piece by piece, had been heavier than she realized. 4 months after her departure from Crumb and Crust, Sofia stood in the warm, flower-scented space of Hearth and Hand, watching a weekend workshop in progress. 12 students of varying ages were learning to shape sourdough bowls, their hands awkwardly mimicking the movements she demonstrated. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating flour dust dancing in the air. In one corner, Marco was coaching an older gentleman who was struggling with the tension in his dough. In another, Gabriella was explaining fermentation science to a group of culinary students. The retail space at the front was comfortably busy, with customers browsing the day's selection of breads and pastries produced during the professional classes. Sofia felt a profound sense of rightness. This space, this business, aligned perfectly with her values and strengths. She was teaching again, preserving traditional methods, and building community through shared knowledge. A notification chimed on her phone. It was an email from James, the third he had sent in the past 2 weeks. She opened it reluctantly. James expressed hope that she was well, then explained that they needed to discuss technical issues they were having with the sourdough program. Several customers had commented on changes in quality and consistency. Ethan had made adjustments, but results remained inconsistent. James inquired if Sofia would consider a short-term consulting arrangement to help them address these issues, mentioning they were prepared to offer generous compensation. Sofia wasn't surprised. She had heard through industry friends that Crumb and Crust was struggling. Ethan's trendy improvements had initially attracted food influencers, but the regular customers who valued consistency had begun to disappear. Several one-star reviews mentioned declining quality and drastic changes to beloved recipes. Sofia felt no pleasure in their difficulties. She had built that bakery from nothing and still cherished its original mission. But she also felt no obligation to rescue them from predictable consequences. When her assistant came to ask about the workshop schedule for the following month, Sofia mentioned James's email. The young woman asked curiously if Sofia would help them. Sofia considered the question carefully before responding that her teaching schedule was on the website. If James was serious about understanding what had gone wrong, he could register for a class like anyone else. The knowledge wasn't secret, it just required commitment and respect for the process. The assistant nodded, understanding the message beneath the words. Later that afternoon, as the workshop concluded, one of the students approached Sofia with shining eyes. The woman expressed amazement at the difference in flavor resulting from just changing the folding technique, mentioning she'd been trying to achieve that open crumb structure for months. Sofia smiled, recognizing the passion of a true bread enthusiast. She explained that everything was connected. The folding builds tension, which shapes the gluten structure, which affects how the dough expands during fermentation. There are no shortcuts in good bread, she emphasized, only processes to honor. As the students departed, Sofia began cleaning her workstation, the familiar motions meditative after decades of practice. Through the windows, she could see Crumb and Crust's delivery van passing by, the logo she had designed still emblazoned on its side, though the tagline had been changed from tradition in every loaf to modern artisan baking. She felt a momentary pang of loss, but it passed quickly. What mattered wasn't the name above the door or the building where she worked. What mattered was the knowledge in her hands, the relationships she had built, and the passion she continued to share. Sofia had lost something precious, but in that loss, she had discovered a path more aligned with her deepest values. She hadn't needed to disparage her former business or burn bridges on her way out. The quality of her work, past, present, and future, spoke clearly enough. Power, she had discovered, wasn't about ownership or control. It was about knowing your worth and having the patience to let others discover it too, sometimes through the hard lessons of failed doughs and disappointed customers. It was about building something authentic and letting its value speak for itself. As she locked up that evening, Sofia ran her hand along the wooden counter she and Gabriella had installed, a counter that would, with time and use, develop its own character and history, just as the one at Crumb and Crust had done under her care. New beginnings could be painful, but they also offered the purest form of creative freedom, the chance to take everything learned from the past and shape it into something even truer to one's vision. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to share her knowledge. Sofia smiled to herself as she turned out the lights. The best rises often came after the most difficult periods of rest, and bread as in life. She was rising again, transformed but undiminished, carrying forward the essence of what had always mattered most.